Hello, my name is Marianne Comfort. I'm an associate with the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas and a member of the congregation's justice team. I also am privileged to serve on the steering committee of the Catholic Climate Covenant. And I'm so pleased to be asked to moderate this Bishop's Roundtable on Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. So through the wonders of technology, we have today Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Oklahoma City. He's also chair of the Bishop's Domestic Justice and Human Development Committee. We also have Bishop Robert McElroy of the Diocese of San Diego and Bishop Robert Barron, Auxiliary Bishop of the Archdiocese of Los Angeles. So thank you, bishops, for being so willing to sit down and talk together today. It's so fitting that we're talking during this Laudato Si week, the days leading up to the 5th anniversary of the publication of Laudato Si on May 24th. Pope Francis has called all Catholics around the world to mark this week with prayer and action. So I thought it would be really fitting to start with taking a look at the encyclical itself, what we're celebrating this week. Those of us who have spent a lot of time reflecting on this very readable document, we all have our favorite quotes that hold deep meaning for us. So I was hoping that each of you could briefly share what phrase or theme has most resonated for you.
Very good. For me, I think I took a fresh look at the document leading up to this roundtable conversation and read it kind of with fresh eyes. And I think what really strikes me and what I spent a lot of time reflecting upon is the whole notion of ecological conversion. And that's a very fruitful path, I think, for a way into the document and the teaching of the Holy Father. There's so many rich themes that we can develop, but that was kind of the what was reaching out and really touching me, the whole notion of conversion. There are many ways of conversion, but an ecological conversion is kind of an integrating theme for me.
For me, it was the term modern anthropocentrism. As I reread it, the same thing, I read it 5 years ago and I've not read it since then, but in preparation for this, it struck me what an anti-modern document it is. And I mean that as a compliment. So the Pope certainly appreciates the permanent achievements of modernity, but at the same time, like a lot of postmoderns, he's suspicious of some moves of modernity, one of which is this turn toward subjectivity that puts us so at the center of things, both epistemologically and metaphysically, that we treat nature as something simply to be manipulated, simply to be mastered, as Descartes said, right? The point of philosophy for Descartes is to master nature. And I see the Pope there very much joining the postmoderns in a critique of that attitude, and therefore also a recovery of this wonderfully rich biblical imagination that doesn't put the human being so at the center of things, but situates us within a much more cosmic framework. So I was struck by that over and over again, by how, in a sort of postmodern way, the Pope was critical of this key assumption of modernity.
Mm. And I would say in the last 5 years, probably the theme that has struck me the most is the Pope's recurring theme of the fragility of the gift of creation. Mm-hmm. You know, we're living in a moment when we recognize the fragility of the whole of everything we consider secure. Yeah. It's all fragile now. And what the Pope was saying, I think, and in a powerful way, and that resonates throughout the world, was our world, which is a gift from God, and the great gift which is the foundation for all life and all humanity and every blessing that we know, that giftedness of creation is at risk. It's fragile. And we are called to respond to the call of the created order, to be there in these moments of fragility and to stop making things worse and to begin to heal the creation. So it's that fragility that strikes me as throughout the document, the Pope comes back to it again. He comes back to it in empirical ways, speaking of elements of science and of history and of biology. And he comes back to it in thematic ways, in beautifully moving, poetic, spiritual ways, saying, this gift of creation which we receive from God and has been handed on to us, it's very, very fragile, particularly at this moment in human history.
Thank you very much. You've all articulated in such a lovely way to give a wonderful flavor of the encyclical to set the framework for the rest of the conversation. So I'd next like to ask how you think these messages have been received by the church in the United States. You talk about ecological conversion, the fragility of this gift of God, and that we need to care for this gift. What progress do you think we've made in living out these themes of the encyclical? And Archbishop Coakley, let's start with you from your perspective as chair of the Bishop's Domestic Justice and Human Development Committee.
Well, I think, in my estimation, from where I sit in Oklahoma, looking east and looking west, north and south, and sort of right in the center, I think the progress has been uneven. I think in some quarters, the teaching, the document has been received with great enthusiasm, and in other quarters with great suspicion. I think was anticipated that might occur is that it could become grist for the culture war rhetoric. But that being said, I think the progress has been good. It certainly has found its way into a lot of the work of the conference is doing in terms of policy development, wonderful programs, teaching opportunities, summits that have been held. So I think it strikes a chord in the imagination, and not only of US Catholics, but of Catholics globally, and of not just Catholics. I think one of the unique experiences of the reception of this document is how enthusiastically it has been welcomed and received far beyond the Catholic world, which was perhaps the Holy Father's intention in directing it to everyone who would receive it. So I think the reception has been, it's still a work in progress, but we're well into it now after 5 years.
Sure, I know a lot of us who affiliate with the Catholic Climate Covenant have followed the USCCB's lead in speaking out on such things as trying to keep the US in the Paris Climate Agreement, speaking out about toxics like mercury, trying to regulate those. So there's been a lot of policy positions that certainly the bishops have taken that have led the way for a lot of other Catholic engagement on those issues. So we thank you for that.
Can I jump in to say,
Please.
Certainly in LA, we've done a lot with it. I did some digging around after I got your good question a few days ago. And there's a lot of things we've done in terms of curricula for the Catholic schools, for the religious ed programs. We have a wonderful webpage, which includes 121 suggestions for making your parish or institution more environmentally friendly. Obviously in California, this is a very lively issue. I came out here and faced first a drought, then a terrible fire that chased me out of my house twice, then a mudslide that killed 25 people. I mean, we're used to climate-related trouble out here. And so the diocese has done a lot to implement it. But the broader point I'd make is this. I think it does take time. I was thinking, when Rerum Novarum comes out, 1891, if you had asked in 1896, what's been done to implement this, probably not that much is my guess. That it took a while for the church even to get a sense of its own tradition forming. Think of, Quadragesimo Anno 40 years later. And then we had this wonderfully developed social teaching involving economics and politics. I think what Francis has done, and I think when the time comes to assess his legacy, this will be a key element, is he added this dimension to our social teaching. Mm-hmm. It's not just economics, not just politics, it's also these environmental questions. But I think it will take time. As Archbishop mentioned, there's to some degree we're caught in the political, static around it. But it'll take time for the church to assimilate this teaching into its broader social teaching. But I think it'll be one of the great legacies of Pope Francis.
Thank you. Bishop McElroy, is there anything you'd like to share of what you see happening in San Diego and living out Laudato Si?
Sure. Uh, I believe there's certain elements of our society, certain groups in our society and in global society that have particularly been receptive to Laudato Si. One of those is the scientific community. There's tremendous support there. Another is young people. Young people understand intuitively the themes of Laudato Si. The one question I have is, and I think Archbishop Coakley's point about the initial point about the conversion is so key. I'm not sure we are reaching that level of conversion that we need to because of the urgency of climate change. I agree with you, Bishop Barrett, on the point, it's hard to measure an encyclical that's a major encyclical a few years afterward. At the same time, we don't have 40 years left on the climate question if we're not attentive to it as a global community. So my concern is that we're not reaching out with that level of intensity. Part of it is that the extractive industries in our society have paid for a whole series of assaults upon the science and upon the realities of climate change. And that's a great problem we have to deal with. But the other thing, just in terms of the conversions, I see there's great hope within the communities of young people. There's great hope within the scientific community and certain leaderships in religious groups, and the conference has launched a number of initiatives. But I was at the Synod on the Amazon last October, and to understand there the level of conversion, what Archbishop Coakley was saying, true ecological conversion of understanding our relationship to nature as a gift from God and how it is imperiled in particular ways in the Amazon. I don't think we have that level of conversion, and I don't think we're coming to it. So that worries me greatly, partly because the climate change issue has such a short time frame on it.
Thank you. The urgency of the situation is greatly noted. And I appreciate the examples that you gave, Bishop Barron, of the integration of Laudato Si in the schools and in other areas of the Archdiocese there. And I think if we look across the whole Catholic community, we see so many examples of colleges and universities having carbon emission reduction plans, and healthcare institutions reducing their environmental footprint, and certainly congregations of women and men religious are really engaged in this ecological conversion and changing of lifestyles and practices. And it's always so inspiring to watch and hear about those. I know Bishop McElroy, you'll remember last year the conference at Creighton University about Laudato Si in the U.S. Catholic Church, and we heard so many examples of how this is being lived out. So that certainly gives me a lot of hope as well. Maybe if we could step back for a few minutes and just consider what in our church's teaching led us to the publication of Laudato Si. It certainly was the first encyclical in the history of the church dedicated to the care of creation, but we know it rests on much rich thinking from the past. So I know that you all have done a great deal of thinking about this. And so I was hoping you could share with us what you think most influenced the Pope in his decision to issue this encyclical, and what are some of the key parts of our faith tradition that he's drawing from?
One I'd mention, if I could, is the Romano Guardini influence. I did some work a while ago on Gaston Fossat, who was a mid-century French Jesuit that Bergoglio relied on quite a bit. But another key player, obviously, Guardini, upon whom he began his doctoral research. When I first read Laudato Si 5 years ago, what jumped out at me was Guardini's book, Letters from Lake Como. So back in the 20s, Guardini, vacationing down in the lake country around Milan, writes these essays. And he talks there about the change he saw. He thought it was a negative change from architecture that was very respectful of the environment, boats that made their way in a kind of non-invasive manner through the waves. And you began to see the building of buildings that were disrespectful to the rhythms of the landscape, that were abusive toward the environment. And then even the ships, now, motor power, that made their way aggressively and so on. But what he was doing there was engaging in a real postmodern sort of reflection on the dangers of modernity. And I think of the, young Jorge Mario Bergoglio reading Guardini with great interest. And I see those resonances all through Laudato Si. He's not against modernity as such, but these more aggressive forms of it. Descartes' mastery over nature ends up looking like something. It looks like nature being mastered by our technology. And I think he was drawing very much on Guardini. Now, to say Guardini, of course, is to say the people upon whom he drew, which are the great medieval doctors and back to the biblical sources. But I think Guardini was a key influence on Bergoglio.
Thank you. Without simply stating the obvious, I suppose the very title of the encyclical points back to the influence of his namesake, Saint Francis of Assisi, Laudato Si, praise be, God who created the heavens and the earth, the canticle of the creatures, the canticle of the sun. It's a hymn of praise, and Holy Father chose the name Francis because obviously he has been influenced and formed by the witness, the life, the teaching of Saint Francis, and I think that comes through very, very clearly. The interconnectedness of all of creation, which is another theme that runs certainly all the way through this this encyclical letter, that everything is interrelated, everything is created, and Saint Francis had that intuition, had that experience as he gazed upon creation, as he opened his heart in wonder and praise at the gratuitousness of the gift of creation. And I think the experience of really allowing one's heart to be touched in that sort of way is what elicits that grace and calls forth that grace of conversion. We're transformed by the experience. And I think that's a significant influence of this whole Franciscan intuition that runs through. But also, I'd have to say the Ignatian insights and intuitions from the spiritual exercises, the contemplation on the love of God from the fourth week of the exercises, or the meditation on creation at the beginning, toward the beginning of the exercises. I think that Pope Francis's own Jesuit Ignatian insights and formation influences him greatly in this document as well.
I might add, I think, a third element beyond the two that have been suggested, and that is the Pope's experience in Latin America. That is, when I read, and I do from time to time, the Aparecida document, it strikes me always that the great bulk of the insights of Pope Francis can be traced in roots back to the Aparecida document. And it speaks of the experience of the church in Latin America. And any of you who have not read that document, it's long, but it's well worth reading, because you'll see there's so many concepts about the notion of the church of evangelizing and missionary discipleship, all these different elements. But one of the key ones has to do with this very notion of creation and how it's under assault, and how that assault is integrated with the assault on people's social and economic rights. It's all of one piece, all of one fabric. And so I think Aparecida and the whole experience that the Pope had throughout Latin America of witnessing the degradation of the land and the water and the air and the beauty of the Amazon, which is such a resource for the whole, and literally people are burning it down purposely to have cattle raised on the land instead of the trees. what is a monumental global human tragedy. So a parasita, I would say. And then the other thing leading to Laudato Si, I think, is Pope Benedict. I think that can't be underestimated. Pope Benedict really had opened up the door in a very important way to the church's stance on the environment. He was called the Green Pope
Green Pope.
before Pope Francis ever came on. And it was, he did it in different language and with a different entry point, but it was a very powerful witness to our long-standing theological tradition that creation is a gift from God and is not to be treated as mastery, but of stewardship, and that we were failing in that stewardship. So I think those 2 points are also foundational for Laudato Si.
If I could jump in, I love both those points, and especially the link between this document and evangelization. So that's the Parasita theme. It's clear in Pope Francis. If you read these 2 documents, you know, the Evangelii Gaudium and then this document, you see that connection. And it was John Paul that said, key to the new evangelization is the church's social teaching. That if we don't witness to the world our commitment to justice and peace, we're not going to convince anybody of anything about our faith. And so the same thing now with this expanded sense of social justice. I think that link is extremely important. I think you're right about a Parasita.
Yeah, I think there's certainly a continuity in development here between the 3 papal magisterium, John Paul II, Pope Benedict, the Green Pope, and what Pope Francis is gifting us with now. So it's a rich tradition developing and going all the way back as in the history of and the development of Catholic social teaching to Leo was alluded to earlier. We're seeing that organic development continuing to blossom and flower, bear fruit.
Thank you so much. You've opened up so much a breadth of our tradition as Catholics that is brought to this moment of Laudato Si. And it makes me wonder how we can invite Catholics in the United States to explore some of these traditions. You talked about Bishop Mark McElroy a couple times in our conversation about ecological conversion and how important that is if we're going to be addressing urgent issues like climate change, and heard about the tradition of meditating on creation and what we think of that comes out of Latin America and the experience of the Synod on the Amazon. Do you have thoughts on how do we open up more of these traditions to invite people into Laudato Si in this spiritual way to start leading into that ecological conversion?
I might say just go for a walk. I mean, I think one of the things that we have experienced during this shelter-in-place shutdown is a need, a desire to go outside and stand under the stars or stand under a tree in the sun. I think an encounter with the real, which is something that Pope Francis alludes to several times, you know, how we're somewhat shielded from all of that, and we've lost kind of our ability in our over technological society to simply receive and to give thanks and to stand in awe and amazement, experience wonder. I think wonder is a key element in leading to an ecological conversion, experiencing the risen Christ in and through the beauty of this transfigured creation. So I think that's, for me, a very important element, and how we can help foster the ecological conversion that's called for here is to slow down, to unplug, to leave our phones behind and go for a walk in the woods or along the beach or under the stars, just to allow our hearts to be touched, to be born again in wonder.
I think to the point of conversion too, I like that language. You know, as moderns, as Americans, we belong to a degree to the modern meta-narrative, which comes up out of Descartes and everybody else. And so that we're in the center of things, we're the masters of nature, nature's there for our benefit. I mean, we've inherited that meta-narrative. But as Catholics, we belong to a greater meta narrative, that of the Bible. And so I think that's key to helping our people is you don't leave your American identity behind, but there's a more fundamental one that we have as biblical people. The fact that salvation is not anthropocentric, it begins with creation. We're part of it. Our job is to be, as we've heard, stewards of creation and also the ones who lead it in right praise. And I'd read Genesis that way, that we come at the end of a liturgical procession and all the creation is meant to give praise. There's Laudato Si, praise to God. We're the leaders, if you want, of that cosmic act of praise. So that's recovering some ideas that might be alien to the modern meta narrative, but they belong to our biblical meta narrative. And I think our job as a church is to keep announcing that from the rooftops.
And I might suggest three ways, three entry points for increasing ecological conversion. And of course, amidst the wider conversion of the Christian soul. One has to do with what I think is our impoverished notion of the Trinity. I think we're often so focused on Christ that we don't focus sufficiently on the Father and the Spirit, on God who created and gave us the gift of creation. I don't think that's a rich part of it. It's a rich part of our spiritual tradition. I don't think that we have developed it much or sufficiently within our own age. And I think more attention to that and the beauty of creation, or as Bishop Coakley said, go out and take a walk. That's a good way of coming into touch with that. But it's with the notion of the Creator who gave us this great gift and of our Trinitarian theology. Yeah. The second entryway, I think, has been alluded to too, and Archbishop Coakley mentioned about wonder, is through children. Often adults can understand the most noble elements of our world best through the eyes of children, rather than through human, adult discussion and all these different things. The young understand this. It comes to them naturally, this appreciation for creation. And we need to, as Bishop Bear mentioned, as they've done in the schools in LA, and we've done to, in curriculum and having care of culture teams in the parishes and at our grammar schools and high schools, but to invite parents to see through the eyes of their children the beauty that's there and what's at stake, which is their future. It's not our future, it's their future. And the third entry point really is rooted in this moment that we're in now. And it is this question of fragility. This pandemic has really upended all of our assumptions, I think, about how our society works, what are the elements that truly we need to base our lives on, what are the goals, what is security, all these different things. It's all fragile. And I think it thus invites us to understand, amid all the different elements of our world that we're going to comprehend in this moment as fragile, that our economic security is more fragile than we ever dreamt. Our health security is more fragile than we ever dreamt. And so too is the fragility of our environment and our world. I think that's a theme we would do well in the church to focus on as a spiritual reflection that comes out of this pandemic moment. Because I think this moment has shaken people very deeply. And I think we need to look to the most profound elements of it and questions that it raises and base our theological approaches and our spiritual approaches and our pastoral approaches in that experience of fragility.
And I might add, thank you for that reflection. Speaking earlier about going for a walk in the woods, and I think what I was hinting at was the experience that comes with that of our own dependency, our own fragility, our own leading to a sense of humility, because we come to see our place in the world. And sometimes it takes something like we're living through right now, as Bishop McElroy alludes to, this global pandemic to shake us to a new awareness of our own fragility. And hopefully that will lead to a deeper sense of humility before the Creator. And one of the things also I think that the experience of the global pandemic has led to is a greater experience of solidarity. Beautiful, necessary principle of Catholic social teaching, but a lot of times our solidarity is not global, whereas this experience of the pandemic has led to, I think, a real sense of we really are all in this together as a human race. Respects no national boundaries. So I think that's been a bit of a wake-up call for me as well, or a way into reflection on the teachings of Pope Francis here.
If I could speak just a word to that last point, I think it's very important, that distinction between patriotism, call it, legitimate, sincere love for one's country, and then this sort of toxic nationalism that we are seeing. And yes, in the face of a crisis like this, look, everybody, we got to work together. Why are we playing these games of who's up and down and who's to play? Let's just work together. So, but I think as Catholics, we bring something really key to that conversation, because yes, we're Americans, but we also belong to this marvelous international community that is more important to us than our national identity. Even as we're patriots, love being an American, but it's more important to me to be a Catholic. And that means I'm part of an international reality. And I think we can bring something to that conversation. We can bring that perspective, the global perspective, which is obviously at a practical level much needed right now.
Yeah, thank you for bringing it up, this current reality that we're all living. Certainly this global pandemic kind of is certainly the context in which we're all living in so many different levels. And I know that the Vatican has convened a new COVID-19 task force that's looking at all the ways that the church can be engaged, both really direct, immediate humanitarian assistance, but also really looking at how we come out on the other side of this pandemic as a more just, environmentally sustainable world. So I'm wondering, what you think the encyclical has to say about what recovery, so to speak, from this pandemic might look like, and how we can envision, as we're attending to the immediate direct needs of people, what we can envision moving much further into the future, and taking the learnings from this and the learnings from Laudato Si, and moving into the future together as Catholics, as a worldwide community.
I think as we move through this, especially in these next weeks, we face some very pivotal questions of what do we value. I'm a bishop in the diocese in San Diego. We're seeking to open up the churches for religious activity because people long for the Eucharist. At the same time, I'm scared that in doing so, if we don't do it right, people may get sick again. And so I think we're facing in this crisis pivotal and fundamental questions about what are the most important goals in our society, what are the most sacred elements of human life. And I think that probably is the framework, Marianne, we can address the question you raised, which is a very important one, which is I studied John Courtney Murray, did my dissertation on him, but one of his notions was the res sacra, the sacred elements of human life. And we have to ask ourselves, what are the sacred elements? I think people are rediscovering them in this moment. And they're different from what they wouldn't have called it sacred, but what they would have valued 3 months ago. And so I think it is a moment of potential rediscovery for us, what those really sacred elements are. And within that, I believe, will be care for the created order. and an understanding of the fragility of that, but also will be the socioeconomic questions, the question of solidarity, as Archbishop Coakley had raised, the question of anthropomorphism, as Bishop Barron talked about at the beginning. All of those come into play. But I think we as a society are going to, people at all levels, when I talk to people pastorally, they're wrestling with very fundamental questions. I remember talking with a woman in her 90s, and she says, she's locked down in not a convalescent home, but in an independent living. She says, I'm afraid to see my grandchildren because I may get sick, but I'm even more afraid to live a life where I'll never get to see my grandchildren and hold them again. And these are the issues I think we have to, at that level, at that very deep level, talk about within the life of the church and hopefully address in some profound ways. And I think that will lead, Marianne, just on the path we are talking about.
I just got this sort of amusing move, I suppose. I'm eager to see what other people think about it. I know it's in the church's social teaching from at least John the 23rd on that the appeal is made to some kind of international or transnational authority that might be able to adjudicate political and, in this case, environmental issues. And I've always been skeptical, I suppose. I'm just wondering whether in a world, with the kind of leadership we have in the major nations, if we could even imagine our leaders surrendering their authority to an international group that would really have the authority to, make a difference. I don't know. I think it's a velleity in a way. It's a lovely hope. I'm just not sure how realistic it is. I like what Bishop McElroy is saying about maybe it's some more subsidiarity moves. It's moves that we make in education and witness and reminding people of the real values of bringing this teaching to bear from the ground up. It just strikes me as a more hopeful way. Again, I'm just sort of musing about it. As I reread the encyclical, again, as all the popes have, from John the 23rd on, they've all made appeal to a kind of grand international authority. I don't know. I don't know if that's a realistic proposal.
Yeah. I would have to resonate with Bishop Barron's observation there. And maybe it's because of I am an American, glad to be so, but it really is hard to imagine some sort of a global transnational authority. I find a lot greater hope in the possibilities of what the Holy Father talks about as the ecology of everyday life. I mean, starting at the grassroots level, influencing and impacting by our witness and personal example those around us from the ground up to build a new awareness of our interconnectedness. And one thing I'm really hopeful about is I really do think that our Holy Father is articulating insights and making connections that really, I think, can provide, in a certain sense, a new and more nuanced and richer hermeneutic for our Catholic social teaching, and seeing the interconnectedness, interrelatedness of everything that can reach into so many aspects of our public life, but also our moral life, our life of witness. And one of the things that I was reflecting on, just in terms of the interrelatedness of everything, of all of creation, was the whole mystery of human fertility. The Holy Father speaks there of the importance of respecting and reverencing the embryo. But I'm thinking of the wisdom that the Church has in, for example, its teaching on natural family planning. We have this respect for natural processes and cycles and what is given. And the tendency in our culture for the last 70 years or so has been to try to master that and impose that and insert pour chemicals into that will sterilize that natural, beautiful process of fertility. I think there are insights here that can help us maybe to find ways to articulate the beautiful teaching of St. Paul VI on Humanae Vitae, finding a new language in this document on the interrelatedness of all things, interconnectedness, to maybe propose that tradition, that teaching in a way that's going to resonate with people today.
If I could say one thing about the church's tradition on international authority, which often gets caricatured or distorted in some ways. When John the 23rd and Pachamenteris talked about it in a very crystallizing moment, it was a notion rooted in subsidiarity that said that the international community is a community with its own common good. And that doesn't mean you need an international government as we think of it in some monist way, but rather international collaboration. And when we say it this way, look at disease control. Ebola, all these different former pandemics we could have been wrestling with, and they were dealt with, cholera, measles, all these different elements. They were dealt with through international cooperation. Similarly, economically, so often, the debt reductions that help so many poor countries in the world, those are international efforts. And in a very real way, there's going to have to be international collaboration that's structured to deal with climate change and the different parts of the environment. That's different from an international government, but it is structured international collaboration. And so I do think we need to keep pointing to that as one element. I agree with Archbishop Kobe. It begins in the individual and community conversion. That's the heart of this. The conversion, the ecological conversion, and the wider conversion of heart is the soul. That's the foundation for all this. But there does, I believe, have to be an international component that's not ephemeral and that is structured and has a certain enduring pattern to it, so that these monumental problems, which do not lie with any one nation, can be addressed effectively.
And what is it though? Because I'm with you. I wrestle with the same thing. I wrestle with it as the church articulates that. But they seem at times to be gesturing toward the United Nations, but then they don't say that explicitly. So, what does it look like, in fact? And I really mean that as sort of an honest, musing question. What would that, as you say, international, structure look like in concreto? I don't know. I'm not sure. But I agree with you. I think the need for it is there. No question about it.
I think it lies probably around issue areas.
Yeah.
Again, not thinking of it as some general pattern of governance from the top down, certainly, because when John 23 talked about it, it was a very, very much informed by subsidiarity. But his notion was our international society is so global that there is an international common good, and that has to be tended to in structured ways. I believe that. But and that's frankly how international health has been addressed successfully in so many ways. It's like natural disasters. Before a disaster in Italy, an earthquake at the end of the 19th century, countries didn't help each other with international disasters. Now they do. So that there's structures that come up, the international community comes together to accomplish certain specific aims. And I think that's, and climate change is going to have to be one of those.
Yeah, around particular issues.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for that musing. Thinking back in Laudato Si, and the Pope certainly throughout talks about the importance of international cooperation on a number of issues, climate change being one of them. And so I appreciated that sharing you all just had around this moment we're in, what the church can contribute, what our teachings can contribute. Mm-hmm. And finally, I think that our conversation is an opportunity for looking forward. The Vatican earlier this week announced the Laudato Si special anniversary year that's going to commence on Sunday, which is the day that the Pope called for a global day of prayer. And then the year is going to run through the anniversary next year on May 24th. And in that year, the Vatican is including a call to public commitments on the part of Catholic institutions around the world to begin a 7-year journey to what they're calling total sustainability in the spirit of Laudato Si. So when we're thinking about Laudato Si and the Catholic Church, what do you think that we as Catholics in the United States can do to embrace the message of over those next 7 years that the Vatican's inviting us to? And what might we want to be saying we accomplished when we celebrate the encyclical's 12th anniversary in 2020?
Hmm.
I might suggest it would be good, I think, in light of what we're going through at this moment, as we come out of this and ask deep level questions, to ask ourselves lifestyle questions. That's hard to do. And I think all of us sitting around here could ask ourselves very pointedly lifestyle questions, and there are changes we should make. But I think for our society as a whole, this is a good moment to do that. Sadly, in this moment of epidemic, the assault upon the environment has diminished because the extractive industries have diminished, and the pollution of the earth and the water and the air has diminished. But that's not exactly how we want to do it. We want to do it by finding new ways of living, and some technology can help us with. This Bishop Barrett earlier talked about what has been done in Los Angeles. They're lucky as we're lucky in San Diego. Solar paneling was very easy to ask our parishes to do, because even parish finance councils, which were the most reluctant theoretically to move into it, when they saw the figures, they went for it quite profoundly. So there's structural ways we need to move on that, but there are interior parts of our lives, and it's unavoidable that we're going to have to make sacrifices. But I do think this is a moment when that could be advanced, because it's a moment when we'll be looking at, for all of us, what are our priorities in life? And for people with families, and they're worried about their jobs, they're worried about their mortgages, all these things, and to be able to ask these fundamental questions and reforge their lives and our lives in ways that are less tied to material things and more friendly to the environment.
Five years from now, or 7 years from now, I guess I would hope that perhaps through what we have been living through and ongoing reflection on the teachings of Laudato Si, that our Catholic social teaching might be better received as with a recognition of that it is an integral system of teachings that is we recognize the respect that is due not only to nature and the natural world, but to care for the poor, care for the earth, care for the unborn, and our commitment to care for one another. So I hope that we're able, through this experience over the next years, to kind of dust off and polish up and represent our Catholic social teaching, which is such a rich and beautiful teaching in a way that is, as I said, more attractive to more people, including our own Catholics. I think, I am here in Oklahoma, where energy industry, particularly gas and oil, is kind of the foundation of our economics. We are certainly moving in directions of renewable sources, a lot of wind power here, and not so much solar, but we have lots of wind here. But to be able to present all of this in a way that is attractive to people, that this is all part of a vision of life and of creation and of stewardship that is that's appealing. I think it does appeal to young people, as we've said already.
don't have too much more to add, but in some ways, I think it's the hardest question that we've been wrestling with. And I don't know, maybe it strikes you strange, but I go back to Vatican II's call for a biblical revival. And it doesn't just mean a technical knowledge of the Bible. I think it means introducing people to the world of the Bible, which is different than the world of modernity. And as I started with this, as I read this document, I kept thinking, yes, we're shaped by Descartes' world of human beings in the center and we're the masters of nature. And then the end result of that are all the things we've been talking about, all these negatives. So the conversion, again, go back to Archbishop's point, the conversion, it's a biblical conversion. It's a conversion to a different worldview. God the creator, as Bishop McElroy said, God who redeems not just us, but redeems all of creation. That's a conversion at a very deep level of consciousness that will finally result in changes that we want. And I know that can maybe sound all too abstract, and we should do very concrete things. I quite agree with that. But maybe it's a conversion to a different way of imagining the world that comes up out of the Bible. And that's something we as a church can and should be doing.
Thank you very much. Very helpful. Always good to end on a note of looking forward and where we're heading towards. So I thank you for that. So it seems like a natural place to bring our conversation to a close. So I'd just like to thank you, bishops, for taking this time for this very rich conversation on Laudato Si. I know there's lots to explore on this topic, and we're just scratching the surface, but certainly invite everyone watching us live and on the recording later to continue these conversations in our dioceses, our parishes, our schools, our healthcare institutions, religious congregations, all the settings where we can bring the encyclical to life. So for now, I thank everyone for participating in this special roundtable on Laudato Si, and I wish you a very good rest of Laudato Si week.
Thank you, Mary.
Thank you very much.
Right.
God bless.
God bless.
Bye-bye.